Hi, this is Isaac, and welcome to my Donkey Kong Land playthrough. This was originally released for the Game Boy, and right now I'm playing it on the Retron 5 console, which is a console that plays many different types of games for many different types of consoles and handhelds, including the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, as well as the NES and the Famicom, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, and it can also play region-free games from all of those consoles and their other region counterparts like the Mega Drive, as well as the Super Famicom. And the reason I'm using this is really just for the ability to use save states, and also so I don't have to replace batteries on the different cartridges. I could just use save states to save the games, and use the Retron 5 save feature so that even when the batteries on the games run out, I can still save the game using the Retron 5's built-in save feature, as well as save states. And for the older games, save states is really important so that I use save states to practice the game, so I don't have to redo sections over and over, and I can practice sections individually. And then when I've gotten a section down, I can go ahead and do it without save states. And then I can make my way through and play through the game without using save states. And this way I can save having to replay parts multiple times because of a lack of save feature or password feature, and having to use passwords and having games with limited continues and having to start from the beginning and so on. Now, in terms of saving in this game, it's interesting because in order to save, you have to collect all the Kong letters and beat a level, or beat a boss of a world. And then you get the option to save. And old cartridge games used batteries in order to save the game, before the days of memory cards and consoles being able to save the game without memory cards. And the battery would die like a watch battery eventually, and then you would lose your data, and you would have to get a battery in order to replace it, in order to start save your game again. And I am using the cartridge of the game and not emulation, though I'm using an emulation-based console, but so the resolution is a bit better, but it's still using the original cartridge of the game. And I use original hardware for ones that can't be played on the Retron 5, like the Nintendo 64 and the PS1 and the Sega Saturn and so on. And modern consoles, I don't use emulation for those. And I don't use ROMs, I always use the original hardware. I always use the original games or some kind of equivalent. I don't download ROMs or anything like that off the internet. For free, I always use the original paid, developer approved way to play the game. Even for expensive games, I go ahead and buy them, and if I feel like they're too expensive, then I just don't go ahead and play them. When you begin the game, there's no intro, and the ending itself is very brief, so the story for this game really is just contained in the manual, and I'll just summarize the story from the manual here. Which I don't have, I just have the cartridge without the manual in the box, and I'll just go ahead and summarize the story from the manual that I looked at online. So the basic plot is that Cranky Kong thinks that Donkey Kong Country only did well because of its graphics, and Donkey Kong thinks that the game did well because it was fun. And Cranky Kong lets K. Rool steal the Banana Horde, and tries to get Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong to get it back on the Game Boy hardware, without the modern music and the fancy graphics that Donkey Kong Country had. And as far as the gameplay goes, it's pretty much like Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo. There's not a whole lot of differences. Although it is simplified in terms of Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong's differences, there really aren't there at all hardly on this game. They both move it just as quickly, they both have the same hitboxes, and they both basically play the same. Donkey Kong can hold barrels above his head, and Diddy Kong just holds barrels in front of him like a shield. But I don't think this comes into play very much like in the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo game. And Donkey Kong can roll and Diddy Kong can cartwheel. And Donkey Kong, the main difference that Donkey Kong can jump on heavyweight enemies, I call them, and Diddy Kong can't. But there aren't too many heavyweight enemies in this game, and there are less heavyweight enemies in general than in the first Donkey Kong Country game, which had 3 different ones, and this game only has 2. There's the Army's Armadillos, and there's the Crushas, which are the big muscular crocodiles. The Clumps, the minor crocodiles, have been taken out of this game. Armies can be jumped on twice with Diddy Kong to beat them. Donkey Kong just needs 1 jump, but Crushas can't be beaten at all with Diddy Kong except by using an animal buddy or by using a barrel. Donkey Kong's roll can't beat them either. At least I don't think it can on Donkey Kong Land. It can't in Donkey Kong Country. There are animal buddies in this game, but they're less prevalent. I feel like there's only 2 of them and they don't show up very often in the regular levels. And there's no Enguarde in the underwater levels, which is interesting. And, you know, there's animal buddies in the bonus areas, but I skip all the bonus areas, or at least I try to, I think. And the bonus areas are there for 100%, but getting 100% of this game doesn't actually do anything. It just simply tells you that you have 100%. In Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, you got a different ending based on whether you had 100%. But in this game, they didn't throw anything in. It's kind of an odd thing that happens. I think the final boss has a different soundtrack when you get to him, but if you have 100% before fighting him, so you'd have to have already beaten him once. At least I think so, that's what I've heard, but don't quote me on that. But otherwise, there's no difference, really. The later Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo games would add new levels that can only be unlocked with 100%. So there's a lot more to it, as well as an extra final boss on Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Country 3. And here we have these ship levels, which are very much in the style of Donkey Kong Country 2, speaking of that game. And the music here is, the first section of it is a remix of the final boss theme from the first Donkey Kong Country game. And the way the levels play out here is interesting because each world only has... The idea is that level types only appear in certain worlds. So in this first world there are only jungle levels, snow levels, and ship levels, instead of having jungle levels being spread out throughout the game, or having snow levels spread out throughout the game. In the first Donkey Kong Country you had a jungle level in the third world as well as in the first world. And Donkey Kong Country 2 you had ship levels outside of the first world. But here it's much more simplified. It's also only 4 worlds instead of 6 or more. And the levels, on the other hand, are much lengthier, I feel like, than in the Super Nintendo Donkey Kong Country games. And they can have more than 1 checkpoint. So the overall structure here is quite different. And the difficulty, I feel like, ramps up a lot early on. Like in this level, for example, is a pretty tricky level, and it's only the first world. you have these snakes that can be difficult to deal with as they can't be beaten when on the ropes. The idea is you want to try moving up, and then the snakes will stop spawning. And then you can go ahead and just move forward without the snakes getting in your way. But there are certain parts where they're pretty tricky to avoid, like that earlier part. And also here I try and find the DK barrel to try to see if there's one around, but there doesn't end up being one. So that's what I was doing in that side area earlier. Normally, of course, I don't explore the side areas and I just try to make my way through to the end of the level without exploring every single area and going to the bonus areas. And I explore every single level and I don't skip any. There are some levels that can be skipped, and there are also levels that can be skipped via warp. Like in the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo games, there are warps that let you skip levels. And in this game, there are warps in different random levels. And I generally don't take them except for one I have taken in the past, but now I know how to beat that level, so I don't go ahead and take that warp. And I just go ahead and be a completionist and show all the levels and not take any of the warps or shortcuts. The bonus rooms can skip you ahead in the level if you take them, potentially. I play as Diddy Kong mainly in this first world, and the reason for that is because of the snow levels. I feel like Diddy Kong starts moving quicker on the snow, but the biggest thing is that he stops moving quickly on the snow, so that means that's much easier for me to control him on the snow compared to Donkey Kong. Although that's more maybe just the way I feel about it when I play the game rather than what's actually there. In the speedrun sense, you would probably use Donkey Kong, since Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong both move the same speed, but Donkey Kong can jump on the heavyweight enemies, and can do basically the same things that Diddy Kong can. And, you know, I just like using Diddy Kong in general, I've always liked him. But Donkey Kong's not bad either, he has his uses in the first Donkey Kong Country game. One of the unique things about this game that could be something that might be a problem for some people is that there's no actual way to tell when you have both Kongs or not. So you can't essentially tell when you have full health or not. In this game, they only show one Kong on screen at a time, unlike in the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo games where they always have both Kongs. This is probably due to hardware limitations, as they didn't want the game to have constant slowdown with both Kongs on screen, or just not being able to pull it off with hardware limitations in general. So, they didn't add anything else to let you know when you have both Kongs. So when you're playing through the game, it's a complete guessing game, or you just have to memorize as far as knowing when you have essentially full health or not. So at this point, I'm gonna complete the last of the free jungle levels. And there are some levels in this game that reuse music from the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo game, and there are some levels that have original music. Some levels that have original music, but reuse level types from the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo game, and then there are some levels that have original backgrounds and original music. The snow levels are taken from the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo games, but the music here is original for Donkey Kong Land. The jungle music in Donkey Kong Land is a short version of the Donkey Kong Country jungle music, and that tune has gone on to become a pretty famous tune from the Donkey Kong Country series. And the snow levels are ones that are interesting, I feel like, because they're early on in the game. whereas normally snow levels in video games are later on, or at least having this many of them, though Donkey Kong Country Free did have a snow level early on in it, but that was only one level in the first world. So here's the first level where I lose a life, and gonna edit out times where I lose lives, but I will have a blooper reel, so that you can see the times where I lost lives. We're gonna go up to the first boss, which isn't named in the manual, but the name for the boss seems to be Wildstein, as the name of the level is Wildstein Fling. And the names of the levels and the worlds are only in the manual, unlike in the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo games where the names of the levels and the worlds are displayed in-game. And you basically just jump on this guy and wait for the right opportunity to jump on him and avoid his moving around. And pretty straightforward boss, though a fair bit more complex than like something like the first boss in the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo game, I feel like. And a unique thing also in this game that the Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo games don't do is that they give you bananas after you beat a boss. And also when you beat a boss, you can get your game saved. And when I record each world separately and then put the videos together and split them up as I want to have them done. Now it's interesting with bosses, the boss music, particularly in this game, because it's quite upbeat and nice, and it's actually quite a big contrast from the first Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo game, which had an interesting, dramatic boss battle music, which isn't necessarily quite as memorable, but still not bad. And it's definitely one that when I play through it, I don't really hear all of it in-game. But with this boss music, since it's much shorter, I'm able to actually appreciate the whole entire tune in-game. Also in this game is that when you beat a boss and go on to the second world, you can actually just go back to the first world. You don't have to worry about going to Funky Kong or something like that in order to travel between worlds. You could just travel between worlds freely like in Donkey Kong Country Free. Albeit in this game, Funky Kong isn't even necessary. There are no Kongs in this game in the overworld. Cranky Kong is just mentioned in the manual and doesn't appear in-game. He does give his hints in the manual, but he doesn't in-game. And I already mentioned how to save, so there's no Candy Kong or Wrinkly Kong. So it's a rather interesting change that they did. Also the whole multiple paths thing, as well as the fact that when you beat certain levels you can get a bomb, which will blow up a rock in the overworld that will allow you to pass. So there's some non-linearity as far as which levels you can play and when. And here we are at the first underwater level. Now, if the underwater levels I feel like Diddy Kong can move up and down faster, he gets going faster and stops quicker, and he can turn quicker, even though his actual moving speed is the same as Donkey Kong's, it seems like. But Diddy Kong just seems to work better for me in the underwater levels, so I try to use him whenever I can instead of Donkey Kong. And here we get the next underwater level, which has a different background and reuses music from the first Donkey Kong Country game, which is the famous aquatic ambience music that's quite famous in the YouTube community. So this level introduces Mincers, and this level is basically like one of the last Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo levels, Poison Pond, which was one of the last levels in the fifth world, which was an underwater level full of Mincers. And it really says something about the difficulty of this game, I think, because here we have a level that's an early level, that's like one of the last levels in the original Donkey Kong Country Super Nintendo game. So there's quite a bit of a difficulty spike here, I think. Quite a bit of a jump in difficulty. Even the pattern of some of the Mincers are like the Mincers in Poison Pond. And in this level, just like in Poison Pond, and in general throughout the game, you really want to take your time to make sure you don't get caught off guard by the various obstacles that can show up quickly. And this is especially apparent in the underwater levels, I feel like, the most. Now, the enemies in this game, the original ones don't all have names. There are a lot of enemies here that are taken from Donkey Kong Country 1, like the Mincers, for example. There are some enemies that have names in the manual, though, and I'll go ahead and mention those right now. So the Flying Pig enemies are Hogwash, and the Nautilus that chase you in the last underwater level are called Nemo, and the big fishes are Fangfish. And the second boss doesn't seem to have a name, while the third boss is called Hardhat, and the fourth boss is the famous Donkey Kong Country villain, K. Rool. And the tornado in the next level after this one is Swirlwind Warning. And the little fish there don't seem to have names. Now, if these underwater levels, like in the first Donkey Kong Country game, and unlike in the sequels Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, these underwater levels don't have any bonus areas. So when you complete them, you automatically 100% complete them, and you get an exclamation mark above the level, which means you've 100% completed the level. So this is going to be the last level that I'm going to be doing for this video, and then I'll go ahead and end the video here, and take a break and then move on to the next video later. So there are these tornadoes that they won't hurt you when you jump on them, so they're pretty straightforward, I think. And then you have these drums that shoot out snakes. And you can't jump on them when they're rolling, but you can when they're stationary. And they just shoot out snakes like the oil drums in the first Donkey Kong Country game. Albeit in the first Donkey Kong Country game, they could shoot out other enemies besides snakes. And this is also notably one of the game's shorter levels. The levels in this game can get quite lengthy, but this is one of the game's shorter levels. Though not necessarily one of the easiest ones. So the last thing I'll say real quick is I'll just give my brief thoughts on this game. So overall, I think this is a fun game that is pretty much like the first Donkey Kong Country game, but on Game Boy. And even though the physics are a fair bit different, and the controls, the feel of the controls take a fair bit to get used to, I think, but once you get the controls down, and once you get the timing down on everything, and know that you should take your time a lot, the game ends up being quite fun. And this is Isaac, and I'll see you later.